Welcome. This is the Ag Engineering Podcast, where we talk tools, tips, and techniques to improve the sustainability of your farm. I am your host, Andy Chamberlain from the University of Vermont Extension, and this podcast is supported by Northeast SARE, providing grants and education to advance innovation in sustainable agriculture. We're trying to improve the industry by chatting with farmers and getting their input on tools, tips, or techniques that have changed the way they farm for good. Many of these practices affect multiple areas of the farm. Whether it be environmentally, emotionally, physically, or financially, we share the knowledge to promote sustainable agriculture, lifestyle, and business. Thanks for having a listen. Now, let's get started. Today's episode comes to you from Plattsburgh, New York, where we're speaking with Elisabeth Hodgdon, a regional vegetable specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Program. Elisabeth, welcome to the show.
Hi, Andy. Thanks for having me.
So if you could just describe what you do in one sentence, what would you say?
I help link growers with science-based information and also information from other growers.
Cool. In this week's episode, I continued the conversation with Elisabeth talking about pest control practices. In episode 34, she shared some practical methods of integrated pest management. In this episode, we have a little bit more of a back and forth conversation doing some Q&A related to pest control on vegetable farms. So I hope you enjoy the continued conversation. One thing you talked about earlier was educating yourself on the pest life cycle and biology. Where could growers go to learn that information?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there are lots of excellent extension resources out there. There are fact sheets and online recorded webinars that growers can access online. And so I would just take a look there at your state extension website, or any of the state extension websites have excellent information. And then also I encourage people that, if growers have a question about a specific pest and want to learn more about a pest biology, just don't be hesitant to reach out to somebody from your state extension service.
What's the number one practice you wish growers would adopt, or you find yourself sharing the most?
Well, it's hard to pick just one, but I think if I had to pick one that would have multiple benefits and kind of overarching benefits for various different issues on the farm, that would be record keeping. And probably some listeners are kind of groaning in their minds as they listen to this, because record keeping is never a favorite activity, or is rarely, an activity that growers like to dedicate their time to. But I think that keeping good records throughout the season can be really useful in planning for pest strategies. And so again, the strategies that I mentioned, almost all of them, I think, that I talked about are preventative and require some forethought for setting them up kind of before a pest becomes a major issue. And in order, to implement those strategies effectively, I think it's a good idea for growers to take note during the season of when pests show up, which pests they have problems with, and ideas for what they want to implement next year, and the timing of when they need to do these things. So for example, maybe making a note to yourself that potato beetles are emerging around this week this year, or a note to themselves for next year to set up those traps for the cucumber beetle when, the cucumbers are still young in the high tunnel. So just, little things like that, because as this season goes on, it's very easy to forget things. And even, personally, I wish I took more notes during the growing season, because they can be very valuable for planning for the next year.
Right, almost, setting up your schedule next year off of this year's events. Like you'll know the mid-June, you got to get the covers up or whatever, it's helpful.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, every season is different. And so pests arrive and diseases arrive at different times, but just thinking ahead and at least making notes to not forget to do different things, and making notes for, for your seed orders, So, for example, if you do have a disease issue and you want to try some disease resistant varieties, make a note for your seed order, just little things like that so that you can use what you learned this season to plan what you're doing next season.
You were talking about physical traps. Do these work right out of the box, or are there some modifications that you've seen that kind of make them work better?
Yeah, so traps can be used for monitoring as well as for mass trapping. And so there has been some research on the striped cucumber beetle traps from researchers at the University of Massachusetts as well as University of New Hampshire. And I think we're still kind of learning about how to perfect these kinds of traps. But for those, you can easily make homemade traps using milk jugs that you paint yellow, essentially. So some of them you can make your own. For monitoring, it's usually easier just to buy the traps from a pest management company. And so for those, you basically just buy the materials and you just set them up out in the field. And so Swede midge is one pest that I mentioned earlier. So those traps are very cheap. So you just get a cardboard small delta trap, and that's about $1. And then set it up in a field of brassicas, and you'll buy the lure to go with it, which contains the pheromones that attracts the insects, and those are about $10. And so the pricing kind of varies by pest, and different pests are attracted to different trap types.
So it sounds like these traps are pretty darn affordable.
Usually, yeah. Some of the more expensive traps, like for example, the corn Heliothis traps, I think I was seeing that those are a little more expensive, like maybe $75, but they last for a very long time. So it could be, that you're spending a little bit more than you wanted to on the initial investment, but then they last for quite a while.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, and I do think it's important, especially for some pests, knowing the flight is really important for pest management. So for example, squash vine borer is a pest that people struggle with in New England. For organic management, you really need to know when they're laying their eggs on the plants. And so knowing when they're flying to make insecticide application is important. For corn pests, knowing when they're coming into your area is important. So even if, there's that initial setup cost, I think that it's definitely worth it.
One thing we haven't talked about much yet is beneficial bugs. How well do those work at managing things? Do they work well out in the field, or are they really targeted for greenhouse growers?
Yeah, that's a good question. So biological control is a practice that many growers are interested in, and there's definitely an appeal to using, quote unquote, good bugs to manage the bad bugs. And certainly the most effective scenarios are in enclosed systems in greenhouses where the predators and natural enemies can't really escape, and they are, they're trapped and only can eat the food source that's the pest inside. But that doesn't mean that there haven't been success stories outdoors as well. So for example, there have definitely been successes using nematodes out in the field. There have been successes using trichogramma wasps as natural enemies of pests out in vegetable fields. But some of the more common biological control systems are in greenhouses and high tunnels, again, because they're enclosed and it's a little easier to kind of control where that natural enemy persists. And some of the more common biological control systems are used for aphids, and so aphids are always an issue or almost always an issue in indoor production. And so we were talking about some preventative strategies, and one preventative strategy is the banker plant system, which I think is really cool for managing aphids. And the idea behind this system is that you can build your natural enemy population of wasps ahead of time so that they're there when the aphids arrive. And so There are these parasitoid wasps that are tiny little wasps. They don't sting humans, and they will parasitize aphids and kill the aphids. And so what you can do is really early in the season, so say for example for high tunnel tomato growers, if they have a heated high tunnel and they're growing their tomatoes early, what they can do is they can start what we call banker plants ahead of time. And these are oats in pots, and they'll release a non-pest aphid. And so the aphid that works well in this system is called bird cherry oat aphid. And again, it's a non-pest aphid. It feeds on the oats. It won't feed on the tomatoes. And then you can release your wasps with those, and the wasps will feed on the aphids and their population will be established. And then once the pest aphids come in to feed on the tomatoes, those wasps will be there and ready to go. And one of the problems with setting up biological control is that it often fails if the pest population is too large. And so again, thinking ahead is really important when using biological control. So if you have this banker plant system set up ahead of time, it'll be much more effective. So for growers who still want to use biological control but really have large pest populations, what's often recommended is actually spraying the crop to really knock back the pests, and then releasing the good bugs so that they can manage those low levels of pests. And then another downside to biological control is that it can be costly, especially compared to insecticides. It can be expensive. You often need multiple releases of these insects. And they can be a little slow to take effect. And so you're managing another organism when you're releasing predators. So you have to make sure that, they take some time to work. They take some time to get used to their new environment when they're released, and to, feed on the pest or parasitize them and do what they do.
That's some really strategic gameplay going on there.
Yeah, the banker plant system is really cool, and the UVM Entomology Research Lab has been doing work on this system for a few years, and they have some good information out there if growers are interested in trying it.
One thing you mentioned is that biological controls are quite expensive. What kind of costs could a grower expect?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are a few different companies that offer biological control agents, and the cost really depends on the particular pest that you're targeting and how many releases you need. One of the more kind of simple aphid pest management systems is just releasing lady beetles. So a lot of growers will release these inside of their high tunnels if they have, aphids on their leafy greens or their tomatoes, etc. And so just kind of and this is one of the more low cost approaches. And so I'm just looking at one of the companies where I sometimes buy or refer people to buy biological control agents, and you can get 500 lady beetles for only $9. So that's a fairly low cost one. But if you need multiple releases of, say, 2 different species of parasitoid wasps, then that gets a little more pricey. I was just telling you earlier today that I had a really bad issue with 2 spotted spider mites in my own personal plants. And I ended up splurging $60 to release some predatory mites to eat those. And so I guess, I forget how many I got for that. Maybe it was 500 of those mites for $60. So the price can really vary.
Now, I have no idea how many aphids a lady beetle can consume. So is a 1 pack of 500 good for a regular 30 by 75 high tunnel? Or do you need 5,000 of them to really be to make a difference?
Yeah, I guess, the amount that you release really depends on the size of your high tunnel, the severity of your aphid infestation. Some people will release a whole bunch directly into like underneath their row cover in a high tunnel if it's during the cooler months. So if you can be kind of strategic like that and really, concentrate the biological control agent where you need them, that can help save costs.
It's a good question. How do you apply these lady beetles or wasps to your plants? Do you just like shake them onto the plants or in the ground, or do you just set them on like a shelf indoors and hope they do their thing and find their way?
Yep. Yeah. So it depends on what you're using. Often they'll come in some sort of a substrate where you'll just kind of shake them from a plastic container and then leave the plastic container itself in the high tunnel so that whatever's left over can emerge. Yeah. So I guess my advice there is, make sure you understand how to release them and the conditions that favor the biological control agent so you can get the best you can get the most from your money. Always follow the instructions.
Now, are there any bugs that you've experienced that look like they're going to completely devour the crop, but really they aren't going to cause such a financial hit?
Yeah, that's another good question. One pest that we have it's very problematic in northern New York, well, I shouldn't say very problematic, but very concerning, is western bean cutworm. And it's a moth that flies around this time of year and lays its eggs on corn and also beans. And last week in Clinton County, one trap I looked at had almost 300 of these moths in it, which is very, very high. And so that seemed quite alarming. But then when I was looking in the field, I only found maybe 2 or 3 egg masses. So sometimes, the traps don't necessarily, correlate fully with what you see in the field. So ideally, growers are monitoring for pests. They'll also kind of be doing scouting in the field as well. I should also mention for western bean cutworm that the threshold in sweet corn is pretty low, so it's 1 egg mass per 100 plants. So it does have a very high threshold, but we don't always, with 300 moths in a trap, we would expect to see more egg masses in the field, or at least I was expecting it. And then another pest that people have been asking me about lately is the salt marsh caterpillar. And that is a very yellow, fuzzy caterpillar that feeds on onion leaves. And it seems alarming because you kind of see these chewing marks in onion leaves, and it's often confused with leek moth, which is a pest that we have in the Northeast that is invasive and is very problematic. So sometimes there are these kind of random and sometimes generalist predators or generalist pests that get into our vegetable fields that cause sporadic damage but don't cause you to lose a significant portion of your crop. And then I also kind of encourage growers to be aware of what the beneficial or natural enemies look like. In the cornfield, I've seen some lacewings. I've seen lady beetle larvae around. So just knowing what insects are not pests helps too.
Are there any bugs that you've kind of heard about might be coming that growers should be on the lookout for, but we don't really know or understand of yet?
Yeah. Let's see. So one pest that my teammates have been studying in the Hudson Valley area is allium leaf miner, which is a fly that feeds on the leaves of onions. And we don't have that yet up in northern New York or in Vermont that I'm aware of. So I would, encourage growers to scout their onions and take a look at any leaf feeding and just kind of see if they have that damage. And you can find information on allium leaf miner online through our extension websites. And a couple of invasive species that aren't exactly new but are still making their way around New York and Vermont are leek moth and swede midge. And leek moth, there are some researchers at UVM who are studying this pest, and my predecessor used to study it as well at Cornell. And so this moth causes window pane feeding damage in leeks, onions, and in garlic. And it can cause severe crop losses in leeks in particular. And there are 3 different flights during the growing season. We're in the middle of the 3rd flight right now in New York. Swede midge is another invasive pest that's very problematic, and I like to, tell growers to be on the lookout for this pest because it's much more easily managed when it first arrives on the farm. But if the symptoms are misdiagnosed and if the populations are if they're, left to grow over time, it can become very, very difficult to manage. So swede midge is a little fly that causes deformed growing points and scarring. And so if you notice that you have any broccoli or cauliflower on your farm that doesn't produce a head, that has, causes blind plants or scarred, deformed leaves, that could be swede midge. And of course, there are some other pests around that we're generally, on the lookout for. So the spotted lanternfly is one. We just never know what invasive species are going to come our way. And yeah, so if growers see any unusual pest activity on their farm, I encourage them to report it because we're always interested in documenting, the distribution of various invasive pests, and that's always useful for us.
Is there anything else you wanted to share that we didn't bring up?
I can't think of anything, but Andy, I was kind of curious if you've seen any innovative techniques that Vermonters are doing to avoid pests, or is there anything that you've been doing in your own garden to avoid pests this year?
Yeah, I haven't been to too many farms this season, unfortunately. One thing that I have seen is the greenhouses that are screened, and people seem to really like that. So that's a fun approach, being able to really control stuff. We just experimented with throwing some row cover over sunflowers in our garden because we planted a whole block of them, over 1,000, and the deer mowed off all of them. So we planted another planting, and we're hoping that the row cover deters them a little bit. So it's a little bit bigger of a pest than a bug.
I guess one other sort of passive pest management technique that I'm thinking of that I'm curious to learn more about is silver reflective plastic mulch. And so that is, just like your black mulch that growers use to grow plants in, but it's silver, and it's kind of hurts your eyes if you're staring at it on a sunny day, but it reflects light back onto the crop canopy. And we don't fully understand how it works, but it discourages insects from laying their eggs on the plants or, landing on the plants, feeding on the plants. And it somehow disrupts the visual cues that insects need to find their host plants. And so I'm really kind of curious about how that works from kind of the insect's point of view. How is that, reflection changing how the plant looks to the insect? And it's been found to be fairly effective for reducing populations of various pests on plants. And I'm kind of curious, how we can use that mulch with other pest management techniques as well. And so that's, another way that growers can kind of passively avoid some pests. I mean, it requires that initial decision making to use it, but yeah, I'm very curious.
That's a really interesting practice, and it kind of makes sense to me if I was a bug that the reflective material shining light upwards would discourage them to be there, because generally a lot of bugs like to lay eggs on the underside of leaves, probably where it's shady, and if it's reflecting light back up into the canopy, then there's a lot less shade on the underside of the leaves.
Yeah.
Well, that'll be a neat technology to stay in tuned on.
Yeah, definitely. And so, the strategies that I mentioned, a lot of them work well if they're used in combination with others. And so silver mulch, I think it rarely, is entirely effective on its own. But if we can kind of think ahead and combine some of these strategies, so say, for example, crop rotation with mass trapping, or crop rotation with resistant or tolerant crop varieties, combining them helps make for a more effective IPM program for your crops.
If others want to follow along with you and see what you're up to and the resources you're putting out, how can they do that?
Yeah, so they can take a look at the Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture website through Cornell. So if they, a simple Google search can turn that up pretty quickly. Let's see, me personally, sometimes I post updates on my professional Instagram page. I'll post pictures and updates on projects that I'm doing. And so my Instagram name is northcountry_veggies if people want to find me there. People can also send me an email if they're interested in chatting. My email address, we can post that in the episode description if you'd like, Andy.
Yeah, we'll do.
But yeah, if people want to connect, they shouldn't hesitate to reach out.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing all this information on bugs and how to manage them. And thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andy. And I also want to make a quick advertisement for the Eastern New York Commercial Horticulture Programs podcast. We have a podcast as well. So it's called Eastern New York Vegetable News. So if people want to kind of follow along with what our team is doing, we have some full-length research episodes as well as some bi-weekly updates on what we're seeing in the field.
Awesome. Yeah, I've listened to that some and definitely recommend Vermont growers and growers in the Northeast check that out as well, because it's applicable information far beyond Eastern New York. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you learned something today or plan to make a change on your farm, let me know. I'd love to receive any feedback you have. Just click the link in the description to submit the form. It will help the future of this podcast to be a resource that is helpful for you. And while you're at it, I hope you go ahead and subscribe, share this with a friend, or leave a comment. And if you want more information, check out the show notes on our website at agengpodcast.com. That's agengpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have a great day.
The proceeding has been a production of University of Vermont Extension. For more information on Extension, log on to www.uvm.edu/extension.